what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to go through a little bit of stuff on crucifixion, and then I'm going to invite you to share your tales of crucifixion. Try and keep my section of this brief so that we can have lots of time for conversation and maybe do some work on how we might tell this tale of crucifixion in various different ways. Now, let me just get through here. Okay, so before I begin, this coming Sunday, the fifth Sunday in Lent, some of you may be familiar with Diana Butler Bass at the Cottage. I don't know whether any of you are also taking courses there, but she did a very gracious thing yesterday, and that is she shared um, a portion of something that is generally for paid subscribers at the Cottage. It's Libby Schrader's presentation on John 11, 1 through 45. And I don't know if you've heard some of the rumblings around this, but it's a completely new way of understanding the text in John 11, which is basically the story at the beginning is the women of Bethany. And just who they are is where Schrader comes in. And she talks a little bit about Mary Magdalene, because in her interpretation of that text, that particular Mary is the Mary involved. Most of us have been raised to believe that that was Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister and Martha's sister, but there's some new work being done from the original Greek, and I think it's worth your while. So I didn't get a chance to put it up on the site because I didn't notice that Diana had opened it up to the general public with this brief podcast. I highly recommend that for any of you who are going to be worshiping on Sunday, take a look at that podcast. It's really excellent scholarship, and it's really cutting edge stuff. I preached about this a couple of years ago on Mary the Migdal, which is the tower. So talking about the fact that Magdalene is not where this particular character is from, but rather it's a nickname for Mary because she is a towering figure in the community. Anyway, I will put that up on the site tomorrow, and I do commend it to you. Dinah Butler Bass has said share it widely, so I'm going to share it widely. Highly recommend it. All right, so let's us begin. A number of years ago, it became clear to me that God's dead, or at least the God that I had been raised to worship. And this is nothing new. It's particularly in the Western world. And tonight I'm going to look briefly at two figures. One is Nietzsche's understanding of God being dead, and I'm going to put that together with John's not here tonight, but John brought up Elie Wiesel's Night last week, and I had been planning to do this piece, and I'm just going to go ahead and do it. But I'm also going to use Elie Wiesel's Night, and I'm using these pieces as a cautionary tale about crucifixion. And so we'll have some time for conversation before you give your elevator speech, your elevator tale, whatever. And then I'm going, because we all trust each other, I'm going to open this up so that we can critique one another. And that critique is a way of us helping to nudge one another to more bold ways of telling this story. All right, so Friedrich Nietzsche is 1844 to 1900. Most of you have heard of him. There was a resurgence in Nietzsche in the 60s, primarily driven by Time magazine, which is really surprising. The "Is God is Dead" cover in 1966 caused a huge ruckus. And then later in 1969, it was posited that God is coming back to life. And sadly, if you look at the kind of God that's coming back to life, it is, for the most part, in what's called common Christianity, it's merely a resurrection of the God that is dead. And one of the things that many progressive theologians, process theologians, contemporary theologians are pushing for is for us not to resurrect the same old God. But before we can get there, we have to get to the place where we have an understanding that God is dead. So that's where I want to begin tonight, is with a kind of understanding that God is dead. Sadly, as Nietzsche understood, God is dead, but considering the state man is in, there will perhaps be caves for ages yet in which his shadow will be shown. And that's an allusion to Plato, and the shadows dancing on the caves. And one of the things that I think that's strongest in the work of Nietzsche is the wonderful parable that he does, where he talks about the famous quote in it is, God is dead, we have killed him, you and I. And this notion that the death of God is liberating in and of itself. So with that as background, I'd like to look a little bit more closely at Elie Wiesel's Night. And I'm going to stop the share because it's distracting me in my telling of the tale. So we'll come back to this in a minute. There we go. So one Sunday, I think it's got to be 10 years ago now. I decided that because it was kind of close to Remembrance Day, which up here in the States is, up here in Canada, it's similar to, I don't know if you have Remembrance Day in the States, but it's like Memorial Day except we celebrate the peace treaty at the end of World War I. Anyway, it was coming close to Remembrance Day, and I thought we ought to include a story from Elie Wiesel's book, Night. For those of you who aren't familiar with the book, it's about Elie Wiesel's childhood experiences in a Nazi concentration camp during the Second World War. It's an absolutely horrendous book to read. And the story I chose from Night is perhaps the most horrendous story in the whole book. And we alluded to that story last week. It's the story of a brutal execution of 3 prisoners. One of them is a little boy who was dearly loved by many of the prisoners, and the 3 prisoners are led up to a gallows that has been constructed in the main square of the camp. All of the other prisoners in the camp have been assembled and ordered to watch the execution. Nooses are placed around the 3 necks, and as they dangle their dying, a voice is heard to ask, "Where is God? Where is he?" For more than half an hour, the 3 prisoners dangled, struggling between life and death, dying a slow agony in front of their fellow prisoners. One by one, each of the prisoners is ordered to walk past the dangling bodies. As Elie Wiesel passes by, the young boy is still twisting. He's not dead. And behind him, Wiesel hears again, "Where is God now?" And Wiesel hears a voice inside of him say, "Where is he? Here he is. He is hanging here on this gallows." Now, this is a tragic story of the horrors of human history, and it was read during our worship service without comment. That Monday morning, I was driving to Waterloo with 2 people who also happened to be clergy. And one of them had been in church the day before, so they'd heard the story and commented on how she agreed that it was a powerful story, but she didn't exactly like the conclusion that God was somehow up there on the gallows, suffering right along with those who were suffering. Her discomfort at the trite way in which the listener, and indeed God, is let off the hook with the idea that, yes, this is horrible, but don't worry because They weren't up there alone on the gallows. God was with them in their suffering, as if that somehow makes it all okay. The trouble with this story is that it doesn't actually say that. In fact, if you read the book, Elie Wiesel actually says that God did die in the camps. The problem for Christians is many of us have heard too many other Christians reinterpret that particular story and cast God in the role of the one who suffers with us. But what if Wiesel is right? What if God is actually dead? My God, why have you forsaken me? What if the whole point of Christianity is to say, God is dead? What if we won't ever really understand Jesus' life, death, and resurrection until we understand that God is dead? For centuries now, Christians have been telling the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as if the whole point was so that Jesus could act as some sort of cosmic fire insurance. You know what I mean. Jesus died for your sins, and you'd better believe it, or you're going to burn in hell for all eternity. Step right up, folks. Get your insurance, come to church, pray every day, follow the rules, and believe that Jesus died for you, and presto, you'll be saved from the fires of hell. Now, many of you will say that that's not us. That's just silly. That's what fundamentalists believe, and we're not fundamentalists. That's not true Christianity from many of our perspectives. We believe in a loving, gracious God who sees our suffering and who loves us so much that he's prepared to actually become one of us and suffer right along with us. And don't worry about the fires of hell, because God's grace is sufficient. And we're all going to heaven when we die, no matter what. It'll be marvelous. Just you wait and see. All you need is a little faith, and all will be well. But what if the whole point of Jesus' life and death are not about any of that? What if Jesus' plaintive cry from the cross is actually real? My God, why have you forsaken me? What if Wiesel is right? What if God is dead? What if that's the whole point of everything that Jesus tried to teach us? God is dead, life is short, we're all going to die. And when all is said and done, this is all there is. So make the most of it, folks. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. What if the whole point of Christianity is to help us experience the trauma of the death of God? What if the death of God is what it takes to set us free from all the idols we have come to worship? What if that thing that lies at the very heart of reality, that mystery that is at the core of our very consciousness, what if that wondrous force that runs through all of creation, what if that being that lies beyond our ability to imagine, that thing that we call the divine, is so much more than we can even begin to contemplate until the God that we have created for ourselves is dead? Only when we begin to realize that the God we thought was God is dead can we begin to discover the God who is so much more than we dared to speculate. I'm only beginning to understand the death of God. I'm only beginning to see the teachings of Jesus in light of this new evolving way of understanding reality. And I confess that I suspect that most of the things I thought I knew about God simply pale in comparison to the mystery that I now suspect Jesus is pointing to. I'm beginning to get an inkling of just what resurrection might actually be. I suspect that resurrection can only happen if there is something or someone to resurrect. And if God did and does die over and over again, then surely resurrection happens over and over again. If God is dead, then we will have to take full responsibility for our own existence. No pie in the sky escape routes. Maybe even nothing more beyond this life. And that's okay. Because if this is all there is, then wow. Isn't it wonderful? And if it's not wonderful, why isn't it wonderful? And what can we do to make it wonderful? Surely this is more than enough. And if it's not enough, how do we make it enough? Life becomes so much more precious when you can no longer expect a reward in heaven. If this is all there is, then let's get at it. I, for one, want to live fully because it's in the living that I can learn about that thing that lies at the very heart of reality, that mystery that is at the core of our consciousness, that wondrous force that runs through all of creation, that being that lies beyond our ability to imagine, that thing that we call the divine, that thing that is beyond the beyond, and beyond that also, that thing that we call God. And that's what resurrection looks like to me. People loving God and loving one another, living fully, discovering, learning, experiencing it all, and helping others to do the same. This is resurrection. This is what happens when we can finally see that God is dead. This is what I'm beginning to see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, but only beginning to see it because I too am reluctant to agree that God is dead. I too cling to the images of the idol which I have created for myself. Just going to go back to sharing the screen because I want to just put a little bit of a warning here. Let me just see if I can do this. There we go. All right. When I was talking last week, I was cautious about the use of a Jewish book in Christian circles. And part of that has to do with the abuse that has happened over the decades with Wiesel's work. It often plays into our tendency to force the horror of the Holocaust into the contours of the Christian story. So anyone who's going to use this story needs to sit down and have a long conversation with someone who's familiar with Jewish literature and Jewish history, preferably someone who practices the Jewish faith. Years ago, I was fortunate enough to take a seminar from Christopher Layton, and he is Jewish. He's also the director of the Institute of Islamic, Christian and Jewish Studies in Baltimore. And he is on a bit of a mission to have Christians stop using night during Holy Week. And one of the conclusions that we came to in that course is that the Christians in the course agreed to stop not only using night, but reading the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Matthew, and indeed any of the Gospel accounts in which the rampant anti-Semitism is blatant and obvious. And that has been a challenge over the years, not to read particularly from the Gospel of John on Good Friday. Indeed, it gets read at Palm Sunday as well. The rampant anti-Semitism that's contained within the New Testament isn't confined to this particular story. And so one of the things that happens with this story is that Christians interpret a Jewish story about the Holocaust, and as Leighton says, force the horror of the Holocaust into the contours of the Christian story. But once that we do that, we are almost becoming participants in the Shoah, which is the Jewish word for the Holocaust. And so I would caution people, and I'm not going to go through Leighton's work. It'll be on the video so that you can take a look at it. But one of the things that um, has changed the way in which I view the resurrection is something that actually you're lucky enough that it's now in Chicago. So anybody who's close to Chicago can go into the art gallery. This is the white crucifixion. I don't know whether any of you have seen it before, but Marc Chagall created this in 1938 after a visit to Poland and to the ghetto. And one of the things that he was driving at was that Jesus is a Jewish martyr. And I don't know if you can tell from this painting, from this image of the painting, rather, the details. This is 1938, so not everything is known in 1938 about what happens in those camps. But we do know about the particular abuse that Jewish people were experiencing in Poland at the time, particularly in the ghettos. And this understanding of the death of Jesus as a Jewish martyr, not as a Christian savior, but as a Jewish martyr, changed the way that I speak about the entire parable of Jesus. And I'm using that word parable in the way in which we talked about it last week. And so one of the things that I'm hoping from this evening that we'll get to is a place where we can look at the way in which we tell this story and critique the story ourselves. Now, to do that, I think there are a couple of things that we can measure the way in which we tell these stories. And that is, how far is our telling of the parable of Jesus moving us away from this notion of the resurrection to an understanding of not resurrection, the crucifixion, to an understanding that there were and continue to be many crucifixions. And this addiction we have to this myth of redemptive violence, which holds up the cross as a way to save us from our very selves. And I think that as we tell one another these stories, I'd like you to keep in mind this image of the crucifixion and the multitude of crucifixions that have happened in the course of human history and continue to happen all around us. So as we're telling our tales of crucifixion, I would hope that we would be measuring our critique around this notion of crucifixions as opposed to the crucifixion. Okay, so this was the assignment. The crucifixion, tell the tale of the crucifixion succinctly in a way that liberates people from old understandings of the narrative about Jesus. Simple on the surface, especially when we're only looking for 2 minutes. But I think that one of the things that being succinct will do for us is clarify what words we must use in order to tell this particular tale. I'd like us to apply the same questions to the telling of each tale that we used when we looked at, trying to figure out which stories to tell, which readings to read. Does the particular telling, uphold, reinscribe, or nurture curiarchy, violence, misogyny, tribalism, racism, or privilege? Can our story be found in your tale? Is the story told in a way that points beyond Jesus, right? Or beyond the crucifixion to the one that is beyond, is what I'm getting at here. Where is the mystery in your tale? One of the temptations when we're trying to explain things to people is we try to posit the notion that we might actually have the answer to the mystery. But where is the mystery? The one which is beyond the beyond and beyond that also, the love that we call God. Where is that in your tale? Is love embodied in your tale? Does your work effectively work against traditional misremembering? Does it turn the tale upside down and inside out to proclaim good news? Now, these are questions that we've been applying to the readings, but I think that they can be equally applied to the way in which we talk about the parable of Jesus. So additionally, I'd like to ask, where do you see crucifixions in your particular telling of the tale? Are crucifixions everywhere? Or are you specifically telling the tale of a crucifixion without pointing to the crucifixions which are around us? Now, you notice that I gave you those questions. Let me just get rid of this and stop sharing. I gave you these questions before you tell your tale. And I did this because I had a brief conversation with someone and they said it's only fair to let people know how they're going to be critiqued. All right, all that being said, would anybody care to share their tale of crucifixion? We're all going to get a chance to do it, except for me, because you've heard me go on about crucifixion forever. And everyone's going to get a chance to critique, and we're all going to be using similar criteria to critique this. Or maybe someone has another question that needs to be applied to the tale. Who would like to go first? We all like each other, so it's not gonna be, not gonna be hard. And you had warning that this was coming, so
I'll start.
Go for it, Jackie.
Mine is quite short, and good. I didn't incorporate all those things you talked about, but it's a starting point. It's sort of an answer to the question about why Jesus was crucified. So if someone came to me in the elevator and said, Jesus was crucified for our sins and so that God could forgive us. So here's how it goes. Jesus was crucified, like many others, by the Romans because he threatened their power. He was the leader of a nonviolent resistance group, an activist who was faithful to his values of compassion, social justice, and nonviolence to the end. In doing so, Jesus points beyond himself to the divine love we call God.
Okay. I think we just got to the 10th floor.
Yeah, I didn't do it very long.
No. That's perfect. Because if that's where we're going to, I said a 2-minute max on this. And I think it's important. And also it means that the nature of our critique is different, right? So we're asking the questions of Jackie's tale of crucifixion. And one of the things that I noticed right away, which I think is excellent, is you put the tale in its historical context. So I'm always grateful when people put their story in historical context. So there's my critique. Very positive. You put it in its historical context. Anyone else like to offer a little
critique?
No, not your story yet. Let's stick with Jackie's. Anybody want to offer a comment to Jackie about her tale? See, you're all going to be gentle because you're waiting for people to offer comments on yours. I know this.
I'm not silly. That's why I went first. They're
I like
just
that
getting
she
warmed up.
I like that she explained why Jesus was killed. I did that in mine too. Why?
Mhm.
Yes,
Why
so
did they-
did I.
Okay. So setting it in historical context, that's one part, but the why part is a bit broader than that. So remind me, Jackie, what did you say about the why Jesus was killed?
Said because he threatened their power, them being the Romans, because he threatened the Romans' power. He was the leader of a non-violent resistance group, an activist.
Okay. So from what Jackie has said, we're hearing that the answer to the why question is not a theological answer. Jackie's giving us a political answer, based on the history at the time. Okay, so I think it's important when we tease these things out to recognize what is leaning on old understandings or misrememberings. I love that word, misremembering. I think I stole it from Marcus Borg. So it's a wonderful phrase. Okay, thanks for going. Do you have something else to add, Jane?
No, I just wanted to run downstairs to the printer and get mine.
Okay, go for it. We'll wait a second. Now, the other piece of this is the next question, Jackie, is what about the broader why? Did you leave that out deliberately?
Well, I said that Jesus points beyond himself. So that's kind of broader. I realized when you were listing the questions that I didn't talk about where other crucifixions are happening even today, sort of thing. I didn't go that too.
Yeah.
I just
That wasn't part of the assignment, but it is certainly a question.
I just said that Jesus points beyond himself because we get so focused on Jesus that we forget he's showing us something about the nature of divine love.
Mm-hmm.
So
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next just to get
Okay.
it over with. Doesn't answer
Is it
all the
that painful?
It doesn't answer all the questions you gave us, but the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth was at the time unremarkable. Jesus, like any other troublemaker, criminal, or dissident, was made an example of, not unlike autocratic regimes in our day. Palestine was occupied by Rome. Jews were flooding to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, a reminder of their freedom from slavery under Egypt. A Moses-like Messiah was longed for, and Jesus' followers believed he would free them. Political tensions ran high. Pilate needed the Jewish holidays to be quiet in order to maintain his job. Extra Roman soldiers were on duty to maintain the peace, and Herod enters Jerusalem to make the point. Religious tensions ran high. Jesus had challenged the temple authorities by overturning the tables of the money changers in the temple. These monetary transactions sustained the temple and the sacrificial system. Both the religious and political powers were looking for a way to silence Jesus. His betrayal and trial are hasty and covert, happening at night and before the beginning of the Sabbath. Is it surprising then that a community steeped in the sacrificial system as a means to be right with God would, once the temple was destroyed and sacrifice no longer possible, view Jesus' crucifixion as the ultimate and final sacrifice, and Jesus as the scapegoat on which their sins were carried away? So it was that the crucifixion and death of Jesus became more important than the life and teaching of Jesus, and the cross, an instrument of oppression and torture, was transformed into a symbol of freedom and love. That's
Okay.
it.
All right. So, two things I heard very clearly there. One was putting the crucifixion into its historical context. And the
Yeah.
other one was using history to explain the political motivation. I also heard some theological history with respect to the the understandings of sacrifice, which was a very brave move, Jane. So thank you for that. And part of the reason that it's a brave move is it opens up a can of worms, doesn't it? It's huge, especially when you consider the fluid nature of the participants of the story. Are they Jews? Are they followers of Jesus? What did Jews understand at that point about sacrifice? Was sacrifice still the focus? What, like, all of that opens up a huge can of worms, and lots of potential for you know all kinds of different tellings of it. So thank you for that. Anybody else want to comment on Jane's?
I was moved by your comment. I think it was your opening one of the death was unremarkable, and that was really a powerful way to frame it, I thought.
It's not only powerful, but I suspect, Jane, you've had more than a few homiletics classes. You got 4 seconds to grab people's attention. You just did it with that telling of the tale. Like it. Anyone else want to comment or critique?
One thing that I perhaps didn't hear as clearly, Jane, was where God was in all of that, except in a more traditional way as the person who needed to be appeased by the sacrifice, I guess. So, I mean, and that's meant as it's hard to be critical without sounding like you're being critical.
No, you're absolutely right. Because I hadn't thought about putting God in there. Really.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. No worries.
And the purpose of engaging in this critical exercise is not to be critical, or not to see the critique as the end all and be all, but rather to hold up a mirror to our own telling of the tale, so that we can hone it. And because one of the things I don't think many Christians who I have encountered actually do is struggle with these massive notions.
Mhm.
You know, where is God in this? There's not a lot of that going on. And so if we are going to talk about the parable of Jesus, apart from the stuff, the warm fuzzy stuff that we all like, or the politician that we're enamored of because it's in line with our own radical politics, we aren't really struggling with the tough stuff, the stuff that we struggle with, because atonement is this overarching label for our own struggle to understand why Jesus died and why it's important to us personally. And does it have any relevance to the world today? And so this exercise is to try and help us to see the pitfalls of that struggle. I mean, this is a real wrestling, because if you remember when Jacob wrestles with God, which is my interpretation of that particular text, Jacob wrestles with God, he comes away limping. And all he really wants is to know God's name. Who are you? Who are you? And so what we're trying to do here is say, Jesus, who are you? Tell us who you are. And if we don't walk away from that wounded, I'm not sure we've really engaged in that. Like, I talked about my own understanding that the God of my creation is dead. That was not something that just happened. That was a struggle. and it was painful and it was difficult. And one of the things that I'm hoping is that we'll figure out ways to have this conversation with others who are struggling to try and understand the relevance of Jesus. And every word matters. Every word we use is laden with baggage. Now, that being said, who would like to go next? Nancy, you have a,
Oh,
Okay, I'll go next.
Nancy, Suzanne, and then Katie.
Okay. First of all, I think it's inaccurate to say the crucifixion because there was and is no single crucifixion. Crucifixion is a fact of life. We see it in today's culture of death, in lynchings, gang murders, gun violence, police killings, war killings, the slaughter of indigenous people, the languishing of refugees, and the pillaging of earth. Today's crucifixions follow the same pattern of violence that was used to kill Jesus and to quell the nonviolent movement he began. Why? Because a political empire always protects its own power and wealth, and it does this by oppressing the most vulnerable. This is why Jesus was crucified and why thousands of others were crucified in his time. If Jesus is God, people killed God. God suffered and died, and whenever humans kill other humans, they are killing God. The cross is not something I can love or venerate, just like guns, bombs, or a noose hanging from a lynching tree are not things I could ever love. They are symbols of unspeakable torture and violence. And we who believe in Jesus cannot imagine the impact of resurrection until we can face the horrendous reality of crucifixion.
Okay, a lot in that tale that is different than the ones we've heard so far, in that you're directly addressing the why question, and you're doing the piece of work that comes out of those questions. You know, are you addressing the misrememberings? And yes, you're directly addressing those misrememberings. I appreciated that. I also appreciated the reality that you pointed out in the here and now. So yes, we can see our world in your tale. One thing I also heard was, can you remind me again of what you said about God suffering or Jesus suffering and dying? Was it,
I said, if Jesus is God, people killed God, God suffered and died. And whenever humans kill other humans, they're killing God.
okay, so say that again slowly. If Jesus is God,
If Jesus is God,
keep going.
people killed God. God suffered and died. And whenever humans kill other humans, they are killing God.
Okay, I love the sentiment. I think it's crucial in the telling of this tale, the way you're telling it. The only thing that took me back to the misrememberings was the word suffered and died, like that phrase. And so that points out for us that in the telling of these tales, there are these triggers that take us to the old stuff. And so whenever we use those to proclaim what we're telling, unless we also unpack them, they go places that we may not want to go. So
Yeah.
I love the way you told that tale in the here and now, and it was the only thing that took me back to the old misremembering was the God suffered and died.
Yeah,
But I
straight out of
love,
the Apostles' Creed.
yeah, I know, suffered, died, and was buried, descended into hell, on the third day rose again. Like those are things that just trip off our tongue. So in the telling of our tales, I think it's almost jargon. It's theological jargon, and I would not, I would suggest that all of us at some point or another, no matter how hard we try, we're going to fall into those misrememberings. I do it all the time. Anyone else want to comment on Nancy's telling? Jackie.
I very much like the way you talked about the cross and the way it's become a symbol that people love instead of a symbol of death, and you're associating it with nooses and other instruments of death. I thought was very, it had a big impact.
I agree. That was very good. Oh. All right. So the next person here is Suzanne, and then Katie.
Okay, this is gonna be really different. So pretend like you're my grandchildren
Yes.
and you're, 7 to 8, 9, 10. So, hi there. Do you know what day it is? It's Friday, and actually we call this the Friday before Easter, Good Friday. Do you know why? It is a special day when we remember that Jesus died, but that was a very long time ago, like 2,000 years ago, a lot of years ago. And some bad people called Romans killed Jesus by beating him up and hanging him on some boards that looked like a cross. They were angry with Jesus and threatened by him as he had a lot of people following him around when he gave talks, and they didn't like what he said. Do you know what he said? Well, he said a lot of things that made those men, those Romans, and especially some people called the Pharisees, upset. Like one time he was on a mountain and he told everyone how you could be a good person by helping the poor and those who don't have enough food, and to forgive someone who has hurt us and comfort someone who is upset because someone close to you has died, and that we should be peacemakers. Some people think Jesus died to save us from all the bad things we do. Maybe you've heard the word sins, that he died so he would be okay. We would be okay with God. But I think that Jesus was trying to tell people how to behave, as they were always having wars against each other, and there was a lot of killing and people not being very kind to each other. I think he just was killed by those bad Romans because they didn't like what he was saying. And they were jealous because he had done so many of those miracles and healed all those people, and they were afraid that he was going to take over and they wouldn't be in charge anymore. So when you see a cross, or maybe you wear a cross, this is a little different than what was just said a minute ago. So when you see a cross, or maybe you wear a cross or know someone who does, try to remember what Jesus was teaching the people to love one another, and especially what he said on that mountain. I told you it was going to be different.
I'm grateful to you for having an audience of children, because we often forget that part of it. And I had some uncomfortable questions this past week from my own grandchildren. So I'm very pleased that you did that. And I think you did what others have done here tonight. You put it in you put the crucifixion in its historical context, using words that I think children could understand. The one place where I was jarred was by the use of the word Pharisee. And I think that as Christians, we need to be very careful about how we use that word, because it has been used through the centuries to hurt people. One of the things that we forget is that Pharisaic Judaism is the Judaism which survived down unto this day. And to lump the Pharisees in as with the Romans, which is, yeah, it's a hard story to tell to children. I would just not use the word Pharisees, especially with children. I wouldn't use it with adults either. And if you want to know more about that, did Amy Jill's book come out yet, on the Pharisees? It's written, it's a book she's written to Christians about the Pharisees. I saw an early draft of it, and I don't know whether it's come out yet or not, but Amy Jill talks marvelously on the beauty of Pharisaic Judaism and how it has been abused as a piece of Christian jargon, if you will. So I commend the work of Amy Jo Levine on Pharisaic Judaism, if anyone's interested in looking at it. Apart from that, I love the way you talk to the children. It's marvelous. Especially children who, yes, your take on the cross was different than Nancy's, but you were talking to a different audience than Nancy's talking to. And you're talking to an audience of children who probably have crosses in their lives. And to try and begin that unpacking is important, I think. Can't do everything in an elevator talk. Anyone else want to comment on Suzanne's?
Yeah, I appreciated it very much. I did feel a little bit like that there was bad othering, bad people. I don't know, were they people behaving badly? I mean, I don't know.
So how would you do that? How would you work that out?
I'm
Because
not-
there were bad people, and
yeah,
there are bad people, and we are bad sometimes.
right, yeah.
So how do we do that? How do we say that to a child? Like maybe, how sometimes you do things that you probably shouldn't do, or how sometimes, like, I think one of the things that it's hard to get across is especially to a child, is to have them feel viscerally the kind of anger that could cause them to be violent. And most kids can go there because especially if they've got siblings, they can understand that anger rising in them. But it is okay to suggest that there were religious authorities, political authorities. If I was telling this to a group of Italian kids, I wouldn't other Romans. That would be problematic. But I also would say, I don't know, Pontius Pilate is a good scapegoat. Because even the Romans thought he was a nasty piece of work. And he ended up in his life being fired for stealing from the Romans. So, he was a nasty piece of work all around, from what we know in history. And so you can kind of other a character like that, as long as I don't think it's appropriate in the telling of the crucifixion. And I'm using this intentionally, the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. I think it's important not to make the violence exceptional. Because if, as Nancy said, who said it, it was unremarkable. That was Jane. That the crucifixion of Jesus was unremarkable and is unremarkable. This happened, continues to happen, and it's rampant. It's all around. So I think it's important not to shy away. Sometimes I think, especially when we don't want to other somebody, we need to bring it back into ourselves so that evil isn't out there. Evil is part of our incompleteness. And the whole point of even wanting to understand that which lies at the heart of everything that is this conviction. And if I have any faith at all, it's faith that whatever is at the heart of reality is love, as pale as my understanding of love is. So how do we get to that place? And I think it's understanding what has been happening in human history. And in that, Jesus is not exceptional. Okay, this is Jane.
Could you use say these people were afraid and angry, and so they acted badly, so that, because we all get afraid and angry at times, and so I don't know, that was just what I was thinking. That
no, I think it's important to bring
afraid and angry.
Yeah.
And maybe mention that Jesus forgave them. I mean, he died anyway, but he did forgive them.
Yeah, that's one of those jargon words. Did he? Or did he simply ask that they be forgiven? See, that piece is part of the legacy of Jesus. This notion that Jesus forgives our sins is not part of the crucifixion story. So don't go into, especially with children. But I think what can be said in terms of that forgiveness piece is, and even though, let me see if I can do this, and even though these people were so angry and so vicious toward him, Jesus wanted them to be okay. And Jesus wanted them to be forgiven for what they had done. That was the desire. And so that's why we try to forgive people, or something like that. Maybe not quite so moralistic, but to recognize that we are in this story too, to help the children see themselves in this story. Like, you know, if you had done what was done to Jesus, if you had done that to someone and that person wasn't angry with you, but wanted you to be well and okay, you know, that question, you don't have to answer it, but just ask the question maybe. But well done for bravely trying to do this with children. I'm impressed.
Well,
Jackie, you want to get in there?
Oh, I was just going to suggest a phrase that goes around our house. My grandson's 7, and instead of him being bad, they talk about making bad choices.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way they would phrase that. So
Bad choices.
one
Right.
one makes a bad choice. You know, I was angry and afraid, and I made a bad choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My granddaughter has sternly told me that I have made bad choices. So I understand that. That's a great phrase. I love it. Next up we have Katie.
All right, mine's going to seem like I'm out in left field for a bit, but just hang with me. A nomadic population's entire day and year revolves around finding and following food sources. Food and survival constantly dominates their minds and controls all of their actions. The book of Leviticus profiles a nomadic population whereby a group of men claim divine superiority over the people to set up a hierarchical system in order to hoard food for themselves. They deceptively craft a system where the population must give them their resources in exchange for their sinful ways. This is an exemplary early example of the powerful exploiting the powerless. The system used religion as a reason for the men to dominate over the most vulnerable. Women were among the most taken advantage of by this system. A woman's untimely monthly uncleanliness presented a very consistent and reliable meal, as sacrifices of meat had to be turned over to the high priest as payment. This egregious system is the root of what people have been using to describe the death of Jesus on the cross. We have been led to believe this great lie, that God requires sacrifices of meat to satisfy or atone for our sins. We've been led to believe that the whole of Jesus's life meant nothing more than to be nailed to a cross as a sacrifice. Why did he bother to wait 36 years then, if that's all he was here for? We are left then with a seemingly gaping hole. With what do we replace atonement? If Jesus didn't come here as a sacrifice for our sins, why did he come here and why do we need him? I believe his personal mission, like many who came before and many who have come since, was to dismantle these systems that oppress, whether it's oppression of humans or oppression of Mother Earth. Therefore, we must replace atonement with aligning ourselves with one another and with the divine force that runs through all of creation, not atonement, but at-one-ment.
Okay. I'm on the 20th floor now. Let me just grab my note here. So what I really liked about that is you're taking it a kind of system approach to understanding this notion of sacrifice. So I like that piece. The part that I probably would try to sort through is the lack of responsibility. So it felt kind of judgmental. And by that, I mean the system was being blamed. The system. what is the system if it's not us, right? So our systems do the same thing. We do the same thing in our own lives. So it's a distancing ourselves that isn't always helpful, especially when you're trying to convey something to someone who may not agree with you. So I think it's important to look at the systemic nature of sacrifice in history. I think that's a really good approach and a way in, but you almost let me off the hook by introducing this nefarious system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I kind of realized that after we were talking about the last few, that I'm definitely attacking in my theology currently with stories in the Old Testament. And I just took classes on it last year, and I'm very, very angry with its content and how it's used. And so I know that is in me right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to get around it though in my dismantling right now.
So I appreciate your saying that. And one of the things that might be a way into telling the tale of the crucifixion is to name that anger. Give me your opening line here. What was your opening line? Because I think
The nomadic population part.
yeah. Say that
Okay.
again.
A nomadic population's entire day and year revolves around finding and following food sources. Food and survival constantly dominates their minds and controls all of their actions.
Okay, so where I go when I hear that is to some nomadic population in the past that has nothing to do with you. So I might begin by naming the anger.
Okay.
And saying, I really struggle with this. Whether you want to call it the myth of redemptive violence or the fact that violence keeps occurring, the fact that me and my kind have suffered under the interpretations of this, like name it, claim it, own it. Because then I'm interested. Then I'm going to listen to you really carefully because you're in it. It's very detached and other people are involved, and I didn't get to the place where I could understand why it had anything to do with us. So I claim where you are in the telling. I had a homiletics prof years ago. It was in his first year of following one of the greatest homiletic profs that we'd had in this area for a long time. And I remember, I think alcohol was involved. So it was probably after class one night. And we were talking about what is it you have to do when you're telling these stories. And he said, you have to do an emotional striptease. You don't have to stay naked for very long because that's self-indulgent. But the story will benefit from you exposing your vulnerability in the story. And so when you're telling a story of the vulnerable, which is, the victim of violence is the vulnerable person, that drags the hearer in a little more. Thank you for that. Tackling sacrifice. Anyone else want to comment on Katie's telling? You're lit up, Sharon. I don't know why. So why don't you tell your tale? It's a nice frame around you.
Oh, well, I'll just start off by saying that I struggle with this whole idea of Jesus, crucifixion, sacrifice, the whole thing. And that I have, for 2 years of COVID, gone into looking at science and how to integrate it with religion. And so this is going to be out of this world. It's going to just be different. So what I've said is theologians and scientists are telling us that we must integrate science and religion. But quantum physics, chaos theories, and algorithms are often way beyond our comprehension, certainly beyond mine. So how to make sense of the crucifixion of Jesus so that it's relevant to us today is really difficult in 2 minutes. Ilia Delio has called Jesus a strange attractor. And that word, that term has really caught me. It's a term in chaos theory, which I don't understand, that refers to an attraction in a system that can pull the system in a new pattern of time, a new pattern of order over time. Now, that's an oversimplification, to say the least. Jesus lived in chaotic times, a cruel empire that intimidated and dominated a wide expanse of territory. The pattern was peace through victory, meaning violent subjugation. But Jesus' way was one of nonviolence, inserting a new pattern of behavior that was pulling the old pattern apart and demonstrating that it was unstable and therefore putting Jesus in jeopardy. We live in terribly unstable times. Chaos abounds all around us. Climate change threatens the very existence of our planet. Violent wars destroy lives, environments, and deface the face of God in creation. Our own individual desires for power, wealth, and dominance are crucifying the earth and her inhabitants. But a new pattern of cooperation is threatening the old pattern of individualism. If we follow the message of Jesus, we become strange attractors and we enter the chaos and attempt to form a new pattern and putting ourselves in jeopardy. The mystery we call God is nebulous, inexplicable, ever-changing, and ever ahead of us, pulling us forward. This mystery is on the edge between chaos and order, the intersection of patterns of violence and nonviolence, individualism, cooperation, in other words, the cross and crucifixion.
Whoa.
That's it.
I'm impressed, partly because I don't understand Ilia Delio without reading her about 100 times.
Me too.
But you've done a brilliant job of integrating her notion of the strange attractor into your telling of this. I'm convinced that you've done more than tell the tale of the crucifixion here. You have begun to tell the parable of Jesus. Does that make sense to you, Sharon?
Yeah.
Like you've taken on a broader assignment and brilliantly too. So what I would push you to do is wrestle with that, because there is a tale there. There is a way of telling the parable of Jesus there that needs more flesh on the bone. But I'm hats off to you. It's not the tale of the crucifixion.
No.
It's so much more than that. And in some ways, what it says about you, the way in which you told that tale, says exactly what you did as the intro, right? So you actually demonstrated what you said about the intro. I really struggle with this crucifixion stuff, da da da. And it's like, you don't want to tell the tale of the crucifixion, because the more important thing is that the strange attractor. That's the important piece for you, because we're crucifying the earth right now. Brilliant stuff. I want to hear the fleshed out version when you finish the wrestling, because there's a lot there. Thank you for that. Anyone else want to comment on Sharon's? Okay, I'm looking at who hasn't gone yet. We have about 15 minutes, Jennifer and Karen and Carol. So I'll try to keep my comments a little briefer. Jennifer, go for it.
Okay, I went super short and super abstract.
Good.
It all seemed over. The hope, the possibility, the love, it all seemed to be over. So very, very decisively over. Where to go from here.
Wow.
I realize in some of the conversations and questions you asked sort of before we started, I didn't really address some of those, but.
Yeah, and those, I mean, I alluded to those questions last week, but I wanted them to be there because in a group where we haven't critiqued one another, we don't have a history of doing that together. I just wanted us to have some framework. So I would suggest that, can you say your line again, please?
Yeah.
It was over.
I said it all seemed over. The hope, the possibility, the love, it all seemed to be over. So very, very decisively over. Where to go from here.
Okay. I'm getting echoes of it is finished.
Mhm.
It's quite powerful for someone who is familiar with the story. It's very powerful. It is finished. It seemed like it was over.
I feel like it's today when I'm listening to you. I think, it seems like our possibilities, our potentials, and yet I know it isn't, but it sometimes feels like that.
Thank you. Thank you. Do me a favor. Would you email me those 2 lines, please? Thank
Yeah.
you. I'll tell you why later. Denise. You're muted, Denise. I can't hear you, darling.
I got a very late start on the assignment. And when I started writing, I just was venting.
Mm-hmm.
I was venting, and it's not even worth saying.
Okay. If you don't want to, that's fine. This isn't the first time we're going to get an opportunity to tell a tale. So,
Well, I could tell you, I could read one paragraph with the venting.
okay, let's hear it.
I hate crucifixion. I hate the brutality, inhumanity, and the torture mentality. I hate the greed for power that suppresses freedom, causes torment, induces terror, forces submission, and strips a person of life. And I realized I was going down the wrong path.
I don't think it's the wrong path, actually. I think it is the path. And I think the hating crucifixion, and then you listed out the various products of crucifixion, is almost a segue into the crucifixions that are all around us, because that venting, that anger, that hate of crucifixion, I think comes from a more immediate cause. So yeah, I think you're on the right track, not on the wrong track. So
Okay.
that's just me. Okay, I'm
Jackie wanted to say.
Jackie.
I just wanted to say the last 2, Jennifer's and Denise's, one thing that really struck me about them, so often we read about the crucifixion like it's okay because we know the ending. And both of them were very stark in terms of that moment when it's all over and you don't know what to do now. And that struck me in both of them. I thought they were excellent from that point of view.
Thanks, Jackie. I see some other heads nodding there too. Karen, have we had yours?
Well, what I've done is not what everybody else did. I
Good.
didn't write about the crucifixion. I wrote about how to make sense of the cross for me today.
Okay.
And it's written in reaction. My boss gave me a book last week that he is a very fundamentalist Christian, and the book is about how things are all messed up in our world because we go to church on Sunday rather than Saturday. We're not following the Sabbath. And so I'm trying to recover from that in some way. So I went back to this sounds a lot like Cynthia Bourgeau, I guess, to try to make sense of the cross and maybe a little bit of my Celtic spirituality, but it's not what everybody else said. So I'm very embarrassed, but I'll tell you what I said. I'm trying to make sense of what the cross means. So the cross is shorthand for Christ's lifelong model of loving and living. As a Christian, I'm called to follow by co-creating love with Sophia's spirit who empowers me. However imperfectly, I desire to practice the transformational pattern of Jesus' compassionate womb-like love in all my relationships, both human and otherwise. The way of Jesus' compassionate womb-like love also means joining all those who challenge the domination systems of this world in the loving, nonviolent way of distributive justice and equity. The cross is never divine will, but choosing to follow Christ's pattern will often lead to the cross in our lives. The cross is the will of the domination systems of this world because they're caught up in scarcity rather than abundant, compassionate, distributive justice and equity. I often miss the mark. So following Jesus is a practice of daily and even moment by moment renewal. Partnered with Sophia's Spirit's presence, I desire to continue practicing Christ's pattern of womb-like love, which often leads to the cross in this world.
Wow. The word that jumped out at me was transformational pattern of womb-like love. That transformational piece. That's really big for me. I really appreciated that. Anyone else want to comment on Karen's?
I was struck by the line, the cross is the will of the domination systems of the world. That labeling of it as a symbolic representation of that was really powerful to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I also wanted to bring the feminine into it. I was really trying to seek that.
Yeah, that came out loud and clear. I love it. Okay, as I see
Carol
it,
volunteered at the very beginning.
Who
No,
did?
I didn't. I was going to comment
Okay.
on Jackie's.
Okay.
What has been said is so much of what I think, but I didn't write anything down. I just was thinking. So carry on with what we're doing.
Okay.
Dawn, I did one.
Okay.
You don't need to. Anyway,
No, go for it.
It's going to be different because it's me.
Mm-hmm.
I was imagining I was in the elevator.
So I didn't want
Good.
a particular elevator speech. I wanted this difference.
I got on the elevator. A guy says, you go to church? What's this Jesus stuff about? And I said, I'm almost overwhelmed when I ponder the story of Jesus. For me, it finally speaks to what I always suspected to be true, that everything that exists expresses a reality rooted in love. Every act of kindness, every insect, every flower, every star, every hug, even every fight is love pushing the story forward. I don't believe that Christ came to deal with our sins. He just had to be true to the love that he embodied. And that journey, of course, led to the cross. His example of love was simply too powerful for empire to allow it and for people to ever forget it. I believe that his journey of love included resurrection of love in the lives of his followers. And the same love is eternal. And so even now I can hardly continue speaking as I approach the absolute wonder of this love manifest in everything, including me. Love is where the authentic is to be found. And Jesus, for me, is clear as light to follow.
Amen. Thank you for that, Andrew. I find your tales of crucifixion and resurrection life-giving. So I want to thank you for sharing them in this group, and also for engaging them with one another. One of the things that I'm being torn here, because my original thought was that we would have some. Yeah, we've only got 7 minutes left. My original thought was that we would do a sort of quick look ahead to Palm Sunday and Holy Week, but I'm just going to set that aside. Because I'd like to stay here where we're at, and so we'll begin next week by looking at Palm Passion Sunday and ahead to Holy Week. But for right now, one of the things that I think is crucial is, no matter how we personally relate to the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, if we have any hope of using that particular story, that particular parable, to shed light on the I don't understand. Series doesn't understand what I'm saying. If we're going to use that particular parable of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth, to have any impact or to shed any light on the crucifixions that are happening all around us, we have more work to do in struggling with that narrative, precisely because the crucifixion is almost omnipresent in our world, in terms of all you have to do is put up the sign of the cross and people have all kinds of reactions to it. And not all of them are consistent with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. And so one of the things that those of us who claim to be followers of the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth fail is that we don't really struggle with crucifixion. And so I'm going to suggest that you continue this week to do some work on your own telling of the crucifixion, because I'd like you to stay there, and we will use your telling of this, and I'm going to look at these again before next week, so that we can look at what it might be like to walk through Holy Week, mindful of our own personal struggle with crucifixion. So I hate to talk about these in terms of stages, but because they're not, you move in and out of them. But the venting is important. The ranting is important. The mystery is important. All of those elements of the struggle, even reflecting on how we're reacting to Karen, you were reacting to something your boss had done in terms of your own struggle with the crucifixion. Suzanne, you're struggling to figure out how to tell this to your grandchildren, aren't we all? It's like, we really have to wrestle with this. And I have occasionally tried to invite people to wrestle with crucifixion. I remember doing it at a retreat full of clergy one time, and they found it really difficult to stick with it. I mean, there's a reason that Good Friday is the least, one of the least attended services of the church. It's just a really horrendous thing to have to face, and it means nothing as a historical event. It only means something if it can shed some light on the crucifixions that are happening around us. And I think most followers of Jesus, myself, I put at the front of that line, have failed miserably to seriously engage the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth in an adult way, because we almost have a grade 5 understanding of, and I realize I'm insulting a whole swath of people, but we really do have a grade 5 understanding. Even those of us who have been trained in the historical events, we tend to regress to what we first learned about the crucifixion as either something we have to fight against or something we have to apologize for. By apology, I mean rationalize. And we do that almost in a kind of knee-jerk fashion without serious consideration of the crucifixion itself. And I get it. I mean, who wants to sit around wrestling with the crucifixion? I've done my year of Moltmann, you know, where you look at the cross and try and make sense of it. I think one of the questions I asked a while back was, can we sit in the silence of unknowing when it comes to the crucifixion long enough to shed some light on the crucifixions that are happening around us? And for those of us who have responsibilities for leadership within Christian community, can we ourselves do that and find ways to help others seriously engage the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth so that we can shed light on the crucifixions that are happening around us? Next week, I want to look a little bit more closely at the notion of what kind of light this crucifixion might shed upon as a parable, as a symbol of the death of God. And not God dying as a sacrifice, not God dying to end sacrifice, which is how some theologians will argue our way out of that one, but rather the God of our creation, my creation, the idol that I have created of God. Can that God die over and over again so that some new understanding? Andrew, part of the reason that your particular telling of the tale touched me so much is that it is using the crucifixion to shed light on the resurrected God in you, right? The resurrection of the new mystery that you are coping with. And I think that's what I mean by seriously engaging this stuff. Is like, can we work together to witness the death of the God of our making? That's where we're going next week. All right. Whoa, it's 8:31. Any questions, comments, concerns? I didn't miss anybody's telling, did I? No, I can figure the telling in a few of them there. Andrew, did you write that down? Actually, I'm going to say to all of you, if you did write it down, please email it to me. I'm not going to use it for anything. I'm not going to put it on this. Well, I am going to use it for something. I'm not going to put it on the site. It won't be used publicly. And your name will never get attached to it unless you want me to. But it will be helpful for me in the planning of the next phase of this, if you would email them to me. Yes, Jane.
I would love to have a copy of Andrew's
Okay.
if he's willing to share.
Certainly.
How about
Thank
we do it this way? Rather than us sort of pick out which ones we want, why don't, if everybody who's willing to share them emails me a copy of what they've written down, I'll assemble it and send them out to everybody who was here tonight. If you weren't here, you won't get a copy of it. Is that okay with everybody? Well, if it's not okay, just simply don't email me a copy of yours. And if you could do that, but let's say put a deadline on that for me, it would be helpful around Thursday or Friday rather than on the weekend. That would be helpful. If I have your copies, then I can send them out to you. So expect to see more resources for this coming Sunday based on what Diana Butler Bass has sent out. I'll put those up. The other thing is some folks have asked for some more specifics in terms of Maundy, Thursday, and this whole notion of Eucharist. And so I'll be putting up quite a few resources on that tomorrow and the next day. So keep watching what's coming up. I hope to have finally put all of Holy Week up by this weekend. So you'll have those pieces, but I'm going to keep adding to them as the conversations happen outside of this session here. People via email and so forth have asked for certain things. So I'm going to keep adding to those resources as you request it. Any other questions or concerns? Well, may the one who is love continue to breathe in, with, through, and beyond you as you embody that love in your worlds. Go in peace.